as that discomfort presents itself, be attentive to it. Ask why it's here. And know that in order to heal as a country, as people in relationship with one another, we have to have these hard conversations in order to get to that healing place.
Hey, everyone.
Wow. Hey again, everyone.
Hello.
We're dropping a link in the chat. If you could click on that link in the chat and answer the question. You don't have to put your name in.
But basically, we're just wanting to get an at-large, top-of-mind sense of where your thoughts go when you hear the phrase systemic racism. So if you're making your way over to the chat to put your thoughts in there, outstanding. You can also drop it in the chat, and and Jenny will be kind enough to
Our Jenny.
put that in the chat, or excuse me, add that into our presentation.
Why don't you say it one more time for the folks still trickling in?
Sure. So welcome, folks. Nice, it's working. So as you can see in the chat, you should see pollev.com and then a name after that. If you would copy and paste that and just answer the question, when you think of systemic racism, what words come to mind? Really just top of mind, first impression type stuff. If that's like, listen, it's too much back and forth, just drop it in the chat and our moderator, Jenny, will just add it to the chat for you, or excuse me, to the word cloud. But we wanted folks to be able to see real time how these ideas kind of make themselves known. Perpetuating, districts, school, isolation,
Damn.
everybody, penetrating.
Ooh, united. That's interesting.
Alt-right, bias, class.
I'm thinking that's Jim Crow, maybe?
No, I think it's Trumpism, or Trump. Got it? Economy, broad.
Everywhere, right?
States,
Jim.
opportunity.
I think Jim is separate.
Wow. So as you, as words kind of like show up in multiple instances, they start to get larger to see like what the deal is.
See how white came out?
Yeah, no, this is why I think I love word clouds doing this, because like this is how organic thoughts bubble up and radiate out, and we're seeing it real time. This is awesome.
And remember, you can either put it in the chat or like go to the link. But this is really cool. Oppressive.
There's the link again for folks who might be hopping on just now. School. Wow.
We were just talking about schools too.
Excellent. So Matt and Jenny, does it look like we've hit like our critical mass, give or take? Got a couple more folks?
Still a lot of words coming in the chat, and I might have capped me out on the website because it's no more.
Okay.
So let's see.
Come in.
Oh, wait, here, it's letting me go again. That was weird. Okay. They're still coming.
No, this is amazing. Jim Crow.
See?
Put that one together. Pervasive, ingrained, non-individual institutions. Yeah. Let's talk, people. Let's talk. This is going to be great.
Just and fair.
Outdated. Enmeshed.
Ooh, policing. Woo. Ancient. Yeah. Some good thoughts here.
I think we're good.
All
Excellent.
right.
Thank you so
Sweet.
much. Well, hi again, everybody. For those of you who are just now, like this is y'all's first call, I'm Verushka. I've worked in education for about 15 years. And as all of this COVID present made itself known, I ultimately wanted to figure out how could I contribute to moving justice forward and where could I contribute? And for me, this is a part of that contribution, is to be in conversation with people, trying to build relationships, but also do deep self-reflection and be in conversation with one another. So that's why I'm here today. Thank you guys for being there. And how about you, Alicia?
Well, Jenny and Matt, did you want to say something real quick before we got started?
Oh, forgive me.
No, we're good. I was still typing in some of these beautiful answers.
Okay, so we're just gonna keep going then. Cool.
So, nope, I think everybody's on the same page. Same as always. Let's stay muted. 30-minute Q&A after the fact. And thank you all for being here.
Yeah, and for those of you who can join the Q&A, we're going to do some really specific deconstructing of systems as a way to like build on what we did in the call today. So just like if you can stay, it might be a really cool experience. My name's Alicia, and I'm doing this work because I need to do this work. You know, I'm here because this is my journey as well. You know, I've said it every week and I'll say it again, like I need to continue in this work and be in conversation about this work, about anti-racism. And it's hard. And, you know, I've been kind of going through it in working and seeing all these like experiences. I too have been going through it. So I just, you know, I want to acknowledge that like today is going to look a little bit different, and that we should definitely consider what it means to be present. I know Via will go over the kind of ground rules, common understandings, but just to be aware of, because as we were building this definitely brought some stuff up in me. So, you know, I love this word cloud.
Yeah, no, the word cloud is it did exactly what I had hoped it would do in terms of organically populating thoughts and ideas that people had, you know, extemporaneously or kind of free association style. So to be able to see what actually pops up and that like classist, it makes its presence known everywhere, white, unfair, school, slavery. So clearly there is a recognition that something's afoot there. And I think to what Alicia offered, yes, we will be doing some things differently, as exampled with the word cloud, but there's still some things that we're always going to ground ourselves in. So we're going to start with our breath. Then we're going to, you know, kind of tell you what we're going to tell you in terms of how to move forward, and then we're going to get into the thick of things. So you want to take us away, Alicia?
Yeah. So today we are looking at our breath a little bit differently. We're still going to layer in all of the same things that we've done, except we're going to talk about what it means to change and support the change towards love and the whole. And as it's a lot of questions, and if you have your workbook in front of you, it's just breathe, scan, thoughts, roots, seeds, and change, and maybe even breaking that down. But let's go through it, see how it feels today, and then I'd love to share an example for myself what this kind of looks like as a whole. So let's breathe, shall we?
Sure.
All right. So start centered, however that feels like for you. Maybe you need a little movement. Maybe you need a little, you know, whatever it is, and just breathe. And then see if you can bring that breath towards slow, smooth, even. Elongating the exhale. And getting ready to scan your body. Starting at the feet, toes, and working your way up. Knees, shoulders, maybe even your scalp. And see if there's any tension that you can relax, release, or any place you can give attention to. And allow any thoughts that come in to just hang out with you. Notice them. And consider if this thought is coming from that love, is it rooted in love or fear? And then consider what the seed of that love or fear is. Are we moving towards supporting the one? Are we moving towards supporting the whole? That small self versus big ass self. And if it's a fear seed or there's something that you're moving towards the one, consider how you might start to change this vibe, this energy to support towards love and the whole. And you might not have the answer right now. And that's okay. But just start to examine that. And then everybody inhale deeply. Exhale through the mouth. And come on back.
Thank you. I know that I always need that initial breathing to center myself before I begin these conversations, because inevitably when you guys populate on screen, when Matt and Jenny like let you guys on and that flood of folks comes through, it's kind of overwhelming and exciting in a good way. So I kind of have to recalibrate, center my breathing, and just remember, stay present. So in thinking about preparing oneself and taking my own advice about staying engaged, I want to basically share out some community engagements or community agreements, and really, to the extent that we're not in conversation with one another, but you're certainly in conversation with yourself, really treat these as ways to be honest and engaged with yourself. And so when I say stay engaged, I think what I'm really trying to say is what Alicia meant by stay present. To be here in this moment, attentive to the peaks and valleys of emotions, to the thoughts that come and go, really speak to the commitment to self-reflection in examining anti-racism. But to do that, you have to look at this eyes, heart, and mind wide open. Because inevitably in that openness, there will be discomfort. We're peeling back layers and unspoken layers in terms of
years,
right, in this endeavor to kind of have a better understanding of the self. And there's going to inevitably be discomfort. And what we would ask is that as that discomfort presents itself, be attentive to it. Ask why it's here. And know that in order to heal as a country, as people in relationship with one another, we have to have these hard conversations in order to get to that healing place. Write your truth, because we ask you guys to do a lot of journaling in terms of the workbook that's offered via PDF, or even in a notebook that you have handy. We do offer a lot of prompts to kind of invite you to take the walk within, to be as radically honest with yourself as you're willing to go, to begin this journey of deconstructing anti-racism in yourself. Expect and accept non-closure. And what we mean by that ultimately is that by virtue of beginning this process, that doesn't mean that there is an ending to this. We are not offering a certification at the end of this. There is no thing at the end where you can say,
I got my ally
right,
card.
I framed it. It's right there behind me. You know, like that's not going to happen. This is a lifelong process and journey and experience. And it's really a commitment to learning and curiosity. Own your intention and impact. And I would say, given the nature of our conversation around systemic change or systemic racism today, I think that this one is super present for me in terms of what one should be mindful of thinking about these kinds of conversations, because what we're ultimately going to be talking about are the more subtle and covert ways that systemic racism presents itself, and that it muddies the water between intention and impact. And so if you can have a clear recognition of your intention and also have a clear understanding of the impact, I think that that goes a long way to being able to be in that healing space or healing conversation with others. Care for yourself. I don't have it with me, so we'll see how well I do, but I normally have this little four-faced Buddha, don't worry about it, that I hold and like play with as I get nervous or feel myself talking too fast. And that's how I ground myself and let myself know that I'm still here in the course of trying to be in conversation with folks. And so if there's something that you have that offers you that comfort as you lean into being present or uncomfortable, by all means, take a moment to grab it. And then lastly, embrace joy and laughter. I feel like before, everything kind of unfolded, I was a naturally buoyant, happy-go-lucky, dare I say, chipper, funny person. And so I'd like to think that to some extent I'll be able to like carry that through. But what I mean to say ultimately is that there's always opportunity for joy and laughter, even in difficult conversations like this. And so I hope that we're able to find some.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, V. And then just continuing on that note of like how we're going to best prepare ourselves today. excuse the up and down, but so these 4 weeks, right? We started with like how racism works internally, externally, and the interactions between the two. Last week we talked about how the body reinforces racism and dominant and minoritized cultures within our own selves and our like all of the stuff that's going on in us. Today, we're going to talk about systemic racism, so systems, structures, institutions, and how racism works and how we are a part of and parcel of those systems. And then the looks and sound of anti-racism will be next week. And then, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So this is typically when we begin these sessions or conversations, we have a centering or an intention setting quote. But I've also offered previously that can be a quote or it can be a video. And in this instance, we're opting for a video, and there'll be another one here to come, but this one is about a minute long, and we just want you to watch. We'll talk about reflections and things like that after the fact, but in the immediate, we want you to take a look, and then we'll go from there.
So make sure that you have the shared screen so you can see it, because it is going to ask you to look for some stuff, okay?
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? Go! The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
We love this one. We love this one a lot.
Thought that was a great find on Alicia's part, because I feel like it absolutely speaks to kind of how and what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so take a second, take a minute, and respond to the question. Basically, this idea of missing what you're not looking for. How might this play out in the larger system structures and institution that we are a part of? So thinking about like, you miss what you're not looking for. So take 20, 30 seconds and write, or
reflect
think,
on that.
or whatever it is you want to do.
For me, this is about like knowing what you don't know.
Give me a second. I know you're excited about this. Mm-hmm.
Just give a thumbs up when folks are ready.
All right, so it's about 30.
Great. I see a thumb.
Cool. So go. What do you think about this?
For me, I thought it was hysterical. I love these kinds of videos where like I miss the thing. As somebody who loves film, like we love catching the moments where people mess up in film. So like this is kind of like that for me. But what it also made me think about is how often we don't know what we don't know, especially if we're told to look for this one particular thing, or that we have to be vigilant about this one particular thing. And so you hone in on that without taking in all of the other information that's coming around. Again, thinking about how we process information, it was super fascinating to see like how seemingly obvious, ridiculous things like a 6-foot man in a bear suit moonwalking completely gets missed. I feel like absolutely highlights kind of what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those things where it's like, once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? Like, so now every time that I'm watching that, regardless of if I'm counting or not, I still see that bear. And so it's like, that's part of the hope too, is that once you see it, that like, maybe we won't be able to unsee it.
And I think that that's a refrain that we've had in different ways, that like, once you recognize that there's a different choice to make, what's that other choice you're going to make?
Yeah, so let's do some breathing then, right? And consider what we just saw. Consider, your thoughts around systemic racism. Consider whether or not you were able to see the bear, or if you saw it, and how that kind of talks about your understanding of like anti-racism. And just get settled back into that breath. Scan your body. Have your shoulders creeped up into your ears? Did you move in a way to relax or release parts of your tension? And then pay attention to those thoughts or any thoughts that come in. Think about where they're coming from, where they're rooted in. Does it feel like love, or does it feel a little bit closer to fear? And then where is that seed of that love or fear? Is it coming from this idea of the self, protecting the self, being the one? Or is it more towards being in the whole, being part of that essential essence that connects us all, that allows us to be truly connected? And consider if this is coming out of fear, or if it's coming from this need to be individual. What do you need to support the change? What can you do to start thinking about moving towards coming from love and the wholeness, coming from the experience of pure being? And then inhale big, exhale through the mouth, and release whatever came up so we can move on and do some more work.
Yeah, thank you. We've typically, sorry, go ahead. Were you gonna say
Yeah, go.
Oh no, I was just going to say that, we typically, when we introduce big ideas, we want to be able to offer clear and succinct definitions. And so we also want it to be tied to an experience. And so at the start of this, we had folks kind of type in where they're at or what they think about top of mind when they experience, or when they think of systemic racism. And then we had you go through a quick visual exercise to kind of highlight where and how you don't know what you don't know, or if you get keyed in on one particular thing, it's easy to kind of miss these other pieces. And so if we were to, again, want to strip all of that away so that we can really just see how the mechanisms of a definition or a system work, we wanted to be able to offer a definition that is also dynamic and alive to show you where and how that context lives in the lived experience. Mm-hmm. And so rather than trying to go on ad nauseum about that between two people, we wanted to show you a quick video that's give or take less than 4 minutes, yes, if that. It's not necessarily our normal approach, but again, we were looking for thoroughness here.
Yeah, and I think, some people may have seen this, but even if you've seen it already, what we're asking everyone to consider is, as you watch this, what is either challenging, changing, or confirming what you know, right? So I obviously am like, oh, I want to focus on what's changing or challenging me, but I also think there's value in identify what is confirming what you're already knowing. So having this kind of lens to go into this in a very specific way. So everybody ready? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it. Oh, there we go.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the Black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases.
So we're gonna pause there. We want to give you 30 seconds, 45 seconds, just to think about what challenge, and just to put it out there, every time I watch that video, I'm still like, I feel the emotions right in my, like, get like tight in my chest sort of feeling, just to put that out there for you. So, you know, consider, what were some things that challenged you? What were some things that changed? Or what were some things that confirmed your way of thinking? And consider your ideas around systemic racism from the beginning of the session. So take 30 seconds. All right, so coming back from that, well, we were, you know, when we first watched this, there were a couple things that came up. You know, for me, something that kind of confirmed one of those ideas that I had that I didn't know I had was this idea that there's no one person to blame for systemic racism, right? There's like, it's this big thing, and it's so hard to kind of talk about because there isn't this like one person.
It's like it's everywhere and nowhere.
Right, kind of like what you were saying about the New Deal.
Yeah, no, the New Deal, but the
Yep, that was a good transition. I'm owning it. It was a great transition.
Wow, but you do have a point about the New Deal. The reason why she's asking me to talk about the New Deal is because I went to go visit Detroit a couple years ago because one of my best friends lives there. And they were trying to convince me to move there. And so they took me to this neighborhood in Detroit called West Village that had a bunch of beautiful craftsman bungalows that just needed a little bit of love. But in the course of kind of peppering folks with questions and asking what's going on, they told me this long history of how basically at the end of the, as a way to try to end the Depression, FDR created the New Deal. And part of the New Deal not only was about creating jobs, but it was also about housing and being able to provide housing to as many Americans as possible. But what was stipulated in that federal housing piece of legislation was that it was for whites only. And there had been recently in the news in Detroit, there had been a story told about a person basically trying to buy one of these bungalows in these historically underserved neighborhoods, and that written into the deed of the home was that it could only be sold to Caucasian folks.
And what's funny is that even on Long Island, we've seen two instances of this, right? Like the Levitt houses, Levittown, were like, they were part of that New Deal program. And then even recently we brought up in Yaphank, there's this like enclave where you could only, like it was written in the
you had to be a German American or a German descent.
So it was just like, those things are still around, and for me that was something that I was like, whoo.
But for me, that was about scale, because the law that I'm describing that had been put in place didn't get abolished until 1968. And if my dad was born in 1954, and ostensibly, if that was only abolished 10 years after he had been born, he's really in no position, you know, statistically speaking, to kind of catch up with a compatriot or a contemporary of that time, is what I learned from this.
All right, I need to breathe a little bit.
Okay. Okay.
This is big. This is big because this is one of those moments for me where I'm like, I just want to curse. And I'm like, maybe I shouldn't, but let's breathe instead. So let's just go back to this practice of what's happening in your body with this information. Breathe. Scan your body. See if you can bring a little levity, relaxation, whatever word you use to allow your body to be here in a comfortable way. And see if you can go back to or allow one of those thoughts to come in that connects to systemic racism or the video or something that challenged you. And consider where that root is. Is that love or is it fear? And then consider if that root of love or fear is seeded from this idea of supporting the individual, the one, or becoming more in line with the whole. And just start to consider what do I need from this in order to change towards love, change towards supporting the whole, change towards being the whole. Inhale big, start to come back. And then exhale. Because this is gonna be another one.
Yeah, I mean, yes. That's why we set up at the beginning about preparing yourself, taking care of yourself. Because yeah, these aren't easy conversations. And I think what I enjoyed about that systemic racism video is that it offered a broad context and put two faces behind it to kind of personalize it to an extent. But I think that the piece that was missing for me was talking about oppression. And oppression is defined as the state of being subject to unjust treatment or control. And the reason why I bring up oppression is because, and I have this image in the back of Leonardo da Vinci's doing something really cool and genius in the Middle Ages. But to the right, this looks like, to me, fascia. And I feel like fascia and oppression go hand in hand if we're thinking about this work yogically, because fascia is also a system that touches all of the organs in the body. And it stabilizes in the one hand, it undergirds in other arenas, and yet it's invisible to us for the most part, and yet we can't function without it, or we don't move without it. And oppression serves a comparable function in what's called the cycle of socialization.
And this is something that often goes unnoticed and unsaid, right? Like in the systemic racism video, it went unsaid that the result was oppression. Right? And just like the fascia, it goes unnoticed very often.
Until you're like, oh, my sciatica, or oh, my leg. And then all of a sudden, like, you're like, there's a problem. So like I offered, oppression like fascia touches all parts of society. It can happen at the individual level, so that person-to-person understanding that we have of racism in this instance, of somebody perhaps saying some, racist word or doing some racist action. There's the cultural piece. There are the ideas that kind of permeate throughout, that go unspoken, that we all just kind of live within. And then we're also talking about now the institutional or systemic. So if you had to think about this in terms of, I just got this DJ Mavic Mini, so I'm super stoked, so I'm gonna forgive the metaphor.
It's a drone.
But
it's a flying video camera.
The individual is, say, at 5,000 feet. Cultural, say 10,000 feet. And then institutional or systemic is more of like a 30,000 foot vantage point for how all of these systems and mechanisms move at any one given moment. And oppression is the gummy, sticky stuff that moves it along.
Yeah, and I think what we also kind of, just to bring it back, when we're talking about that individual level, we think about the minoritized and dominant cultures, right? Dominant cultures oppress minoritized cultures based on the dominant culture, right? Like, these are things that can go back to what we were talking about. And I think, being clear that this can be intentional and unintentional, right?
Absolutely.
Right, and we're gonna get more into what this looks like, but we just wanted to make sure that this is like,
again, setting the stage and just offering laying a groundwork about where and how we can move through this with some basic understanding. So the last piece about oppression is that it's not static. It moves the same way fascia moves, in a dynamic way at any given moment. So you can alternately have, and this is what we talk about regularly, right? The dominant culture targeting the minoritized culture, and then we know that top down. That's a vertical sense of oppression. There's also lateral, right? So if you can see me on the screen, lateral, it goes this way. And that could go from advantage to advantage.
Right, so somebody from the dominant culture oppressing somebody else from the dominant culture.
As an example, little Sally thinks Jamal is super cool from our video. They've been hanging out, they've been chatting after science class, and he's asked her to go steady. She goes home to mom and dad and says, Mom, Dad, Jamal's really cool. He asked me to go steady. What do you guys think? And they say, we love you, Sally. Jamal seems like a really nice young man, but we can't let you date somebody outside of your race. She doesn't understand why, but she knows that this is what her parents have told her, right? That's a lateral sense of oppression. And that can also happen within targeted groups. But for the sake of this, I just wanted the minoritized groups. But I also wanted to just highlight this as, like, again, an at-large backdrop for what we're going to be really talking about, which is the cycle of oppression. The cycle of socialization. Woo! Which is how racism gets reinforced.
And so this is the kind of blank version. You have the filled in version in your handbook, but we are going to go through each piece. So just keep that in mind.
We just wanted to literally just make this as visually clean in the immediate, and that the details are in the workbook. So if you haven't had a chance to access the workbook, or you're just kind of going with this in the moment and want to refer back to it later, just trust that the information that we'll be talking about here is also there.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about this cycle of, socialization, this can actually be applied to any number of isms. You want to apply this to ageism, sexism, classism. This socialization can be there, but our focus for today is how it reinforces racism. So at the start, there's the core. And yogically speaking, I understand that fear, ignorance, confusion, and insecurity are things that you actively are working to divest yourself of.
Yeah, and this is the core of socialization. This is not the core of the self. And so I just want to bring that up because we've seen lots of diagrams, but this is the core of socialization and reinforcing socialization, which ultimately in this case, we're talking about racism.
Right. But again, just remind you, be mindful that this can be applied to a number of isms, but for the sake of this conversation and to really focus our lens, it's through racism. So here at the start of this, in that blue space, is the self, right? The self that we had worked to identify and locate within those rings of diversity now exists here in the backdrop of this photo as this tiny little entity looking down at planet Earth, asking itself, where am I going to land in the cosmic crapshoot of this planet? I am a clean slate. I am a tabula rasa. No blame, no guilt, no consciousness. I am just got here, quite literally. This fundamentally, if you've never heard this stated before, I will fundamentally, unequivocally say it here. Nobody is born a racist. Not one single being is born a racist the minute they come from their mother's womb. They are just screaming into the void like the rest of us. That's the beginning. Okay.
That's really actually like, yeah. Yeah.
So we move into that first layer of socialization. We can consider this the seed or of our cultural depths. So last week, we took you guys through that metaphorical tree of culture, right? We'll go back to what we're talking about here in a second, but we did want to pull this up. And that first socialization kind of exists within that deep culture realm. Who am I? Where do I come from? Where do I belong? What's fair? Right?
Yeah, but it also hits all the parts of the tree, right? It's like what my mom tells me I should wear and, you know, how I am supposed to act when I'm talking to adults.
Because there was already, going back to that beginning place, there was already a world formed, right? There were already, all of the isms of the world existed. The whimsy, the love, the pain, everything that makes earth, and human was already happening before this entity arrived as a clean slate. And that our mothers, our fathers, our uncles, our first family, those first folks that are close to us are really the folks who shape our expectations, norms, values, and ways of how we're going to go into the world.
Yeah, and so thinking about that, we want you to take a moment to consider, you know, you can either focus on one of your identities or you can focus on your identity as a whole, but who and what were the roots of your first socialization? Where did you get that information? So like going back to the who said, right? So take 30 seconds here and answer the who said of your first kind of like formative years.
Again, top of mind stuff. You really want this to be as reactive in terms of like that thinking firing off as possible, because like that's really where you're going to find the surprises. And always just a thumbs up whenever you guys are ready. All right, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that, Jenny. Saw that thumbs up back there.
So for me, I think about my first roots of socializations and like where I got my information. I think of obviously my parents, I think of my grandparents, and then I started to kind of think about like the cultural depths and how, you know, different families gave me different cultural expectations, as you will. Like how my German family had very specific expectations and how my, you know, Puerto Rican family has very specific expectations. And like I lived with my grandmother for a few years, so I definitely had her as a formative person in my life. And so I think about that as like, okay, well, that's my first kind of socialization.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I would say that I can think of my mom as like one of those first, and for sure my dad, especially in like the athletic sporting world, about how to comport oneself. But I think about, I was going to the doctor the other day, taking Alicia to the doctor, and she was laughing at me because she's like, every time you go to the doctor, V, you get dressed up. And I'm sitting here in like, you know, flip-flops and like a pair of sweats. And I'm like, well, I was raised to basically present and comport myself in a certain way when I'm about to go encounter a professional, because I need to communicate before I even set foot or open my mouth that I'm to be treated with respect, dignity, etc. Because if I were to do anything short of that in terms of my own personal mode of dress, that I ran the risk of being treated as less than. And so for me, it's a very conscious sticking point to get dressed up. Whereas Alicia was like, listen, shirt, shoes, service, doc, what's the deal? And like, I can't go into those spaces like that because of how I was socialized by my mom.
Right, and that goes into this institutional piece, right?
Right. So the institutional, or the socialization, the systemic or institutional phase of this looks like, if we were to continue with like the water, like the plant metaphor, the water nurturing the seeds. These are the spaces where the messages that you got in that first socialization get reinforced or bombarded to you, right? And that can happen in multiple arenas simultaneously. They can simultaneously happen in schools, churches, the legal system, in songs, business, etc. And like sometimes they're overt, clear messages, plain as day. Sir, this is a business casual environment. Or they're a little bit more subtle and you have to dig a little deeper. And I think about, again, I always think about my mom because my mom isn't native to this country. So a lot of the things that we're navigating were foreign because she grew up in a different world. But when she got her citizenship, one of the first albums she bought was Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. And it was symbolic for her because of this big step that she took in terms of getting her citizenship. But it also, that iconic album cover represented so much. Him with his little onion booty and in the Levi's.
You know what an onion booty is.
And the red bandana. And like right there with the American flag as the backdrop, it was this powerful image of independence, cool, and a straightforwardness that was supposed to be emblematic of who we were. And that was a big indicator for me back then when I was a kid.
So consider your own institutional socializations, right? Very often the second layer of socialization, these institutional socializations, tend to reinforce our initial socialization. That's not always true. However, I want to give you another 30 seconds to just consider, how did your second socialization, like once you went out and interacted with the world, how did that reinforce, perhaps even give some kind of dissonance to your first layer of socialization? So take another 15, 20 seconds to just consider. You can write, you can think, whatever. And for me, this piece of institutional socialization I always talked about, V and I were talking about this, and I was thinking about my first socialization within my Puerto Rican family, right? And then we'd go to church, and it was like, you don't act the way you act in the house, right? You go to church and you have to like act a very specific way. And so like the kind of reinforcement that I got was, you have to act differently based on where you are. Like who you are has to be split based on where you are and how you're supposed to be. And so I wonder about these, you know, as we continue thinking about if there's places of dissonance where it doesn't exactly add up to, or if they're reinforcing over and over again. Because I think about church, school, and work now, and like, you kind of have to act the same way at all those places.
There are definitely mechanisms of enforcement.
Oh!
Funny you should say that. But thinking about the enforcement of socialization, I want to take you back to what I'd offered about the definition of oppression, and then thinking about oppression as that fascia, or that kind of unspoken stickiness that moves these things along. And this is kind of where it patently shows itself. We can all think about, I gave the example in the lateral advantage to advantage oppression about a way of being or a socialization being enforced about who gets to hang out with who, right? But you can, and to Alicia's question previously, we can all absolutely, if we look down this list and we had a day to navel gaze about it, we can all go down this list and think of an instance where we've either enforced or had it enforced upon us, what the status quo is, that we've been sanctioned. I can say, you know, as a gay woman, had I been running around in 1950s Greenwich Village and I got caught out at the club, I could have been arrested for
not wearing enough
women's clothing, right? Because I didn't have on at least 3 articles of clothing that was assigned to my gender. That's an immediate, recent, historical, legal example of how these oppressions and sanctions can get turned into codified systems that we all navigate and persist in. And what I'm interested in terms of, you know, folks' responses, I definitely want folks to kind of think about this question and respond to it without question, but I definitely am excited to think about like the next 2 parts of this as well.
Yeah, so we're gonna just take a few seconds here, individually, culturally, socially, where have you seen or contributed to oppression as a way to reinforce socialization? So think, were there times that you enforced something to think about that dominant and minoritized group, right? Where have you reinforced the dominant culture? Where have you been a part of, you know, I always think of this one example around hair and how hair can stigmatize us, and how if we want to be a part of the dominant culture, we have to change our hair a certain way or look a certain way. I know, Jenny. So just take another few seconds to consider this. Should I skip this one? We'll just go straight here. We can talk Okay. Yeah, and just as a side note, we're gonna go in the Q&A, we're gonna go over the kind of this structure in about yoga spaces during the Q&A. So just kind of a little teaser, because I know we only have 10 minutes left, so I wanna be, you know,
Absolutely.
there for people.
And being mindful of time. We want to be able to respect your time. So thinking about the results of enforcement, I don't know why I'm obsessed with physics or 2001: A Space Odyssey, but here goes yet another metaphor around physics. Energy can neither be created or destroyed, right? This is no different. When these things happen and this mechanism, this fascia of oppression makes itself known through sanctions, discrimination, stigmatization, or what have you, those emotions and feelings have to go somewhere. They don't just disappear. They don't just get tucked away in the Rolodex. They show up in other places. And here in the red, you can see some of the examples: dissonance, silence, internalization of patterns, inconsistency, horizontal violence, which we talked about previously. But even on the heels of some of these sessions, and talking to Matt and Jenny and talking to other folks who are offering us feedback about how to iterate on this series of conversations, even they say, sometimes I get overwhelmed with guilt, or I'm overwhelmed with how large the issue is.
Yeah.
That's a result of the enforcement of this oppressive system. And that isn't me being like, rally and cry for the revolution. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying here is that these, like energy, it can neither be created or destroyed. It just is, and it will show up in other places. And if we know that, that means we've got choices.
And so just an example for this is something that somebody shared with me at the end of last time. You know, it was a white man, and he said, you know, I saw this black man and white woman together, and there was like an actual feeling of jealousy. And it was this moment for both of us where we're like, oh, this is hurting both of you, right? There's this kind of like energy that you're putting into somebody else's relationship, but then it's coming back at you, because then you start to feel this jealousy, that core, that circle of this experience. It's like eating away at you as well. And so I think for me, this piece really shows that like this hurts everyone. No one benefits from this. So now that we know that, now we also have 2 ways to go. This is kind of the end, and you know,
Whew, right. It's the end with a lead to like our next conversation. And that's we wanted to leave this off as like our jumping off point for the next conversation, to think about actions going forward. But the thing that I really appreciate about this cycle, and I was so keen to share it, was that it also shows you an entry point for where there might be, say, challenging behavior, right? Like the observable results of oppression, i.e. that red round thing called a bubble or a circle. There's that issue, there are those things there. And once you recognize that those are effectively responses to these other oppressions or socializations that have happened elsewhere, you now have choice where there might not have seemed to be one previously. And that's what this piece is showing here.
Yeah, and I think what we're talking about here, and I love how like when it goes up, it's talking about kind of like
Maintaining,
allowing the thing to grow, right? Because very often in systems, we kind of like, oh, we're a part of this. I'm just one person. It's a big system. How can I do anything, right? But if you notice that you're in this kind of cycle, you can start to say, all right, was there a time I did nothing? Was there a time I was like, I don't want to say anything because I'm going to make waves, and right now it's not the time to make waves? Because I've definitely done that, right? Or promoting the status quo, right? These are the things where you're like, who said that I have to wear, you know, a 3-piece suit when I go into a job interview? Oh, dominant culture? Why? What about that makes me a professional? What about the way I style my hair? What about these things makes me a professional? I mean, there was somebody just recently who, you know, they had to shave off their locks in order to participate in a wrestling match or graduation or whatever it was. And you're like, how is this a thing? And what that is it's either not making waves or, you know, promoting, oh, this is how we are in the dominant culture, right? Yet there's this bottom part.
Yeah, I think it's that eliminating of choice is what we're actively trying to say doesn't have to be. And so what we want to think about going into our next conversation next week are like, how do we take those directions for change and actually iterate and build off of them. And what's it look like to change, raise consciousness, interrupt, educate, question, reframe, etc. We're going to talk about that in the next week and maybe in weeks to come, but for sure next week. But we wanted to kind of bring us to a close here for this particular go round, thinking about, yes, this is a cycle, but it's a cycle that can be gotten off, and it shows you clear as day where and how that can happen.
So let's just take this time to talk about one last question, take a few seconds to consider. So either thinking about a time when you did break the cycle of socialization, right? When you kind of went to the, to the left, right? What did you do, right? Because if you're able to figure out what happened, you can replicate it, right? But if not, if you're like, well, I only can think of times when I kind of went right and continued the cycle of socialization, then what might you have done differently? And so take a few seconds here just to consider, you know, when was there a time that you noticed yourself either upholding or kind of going against this cycle of socialization? And what did you do? What could you do? Just let's think about it. Just keeping that in your mind, let's go right into the breath. Whatever you kind of built up, whatever you were thinking about, how does your body feel? What is going on with your breath? This is the moment to really get into this piece, right? This is the moment where you're like, okay, is my body relaxed? Do I have like one shoulder up in my ear? What thoughts are there, right? What things are happening? Consider the root. Is it love or fear? You know, thinking about that man seeing, you know, about a multiracial couple, like it's fear. And thinking about how, is it about this oneness or wholeness? Are you moving towards working as the self or working towards being a part of the community? And then how can you start to change to support the whole, to support with love? And then take that big deep breath. Start to come back. Exhale.
Nice.
See?
All right, so it looks like we are coasting in at 12:58, thereabouts. And so want to be able to show gratitude and thank you guys so much for being willing to, again, be in conversation with us and imagining a world beyond what we know now. And I wanted to leave you, as always, with a quote to kind of usher us out of this experience. This is something that I'd found on Twitter that I thought was very cogent and relevant to what we were talking about today. Diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice, equity is a practice. And I want to thank you guys for being in practice about the self-reflection it takes to do the deconstructing around anti-racism. So thank you guys, seriously.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Jenny, if you have any kind of like parting vibes or words you want to leave us with before we go into the Q&A, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know how you managed to walk us through that. So much information, but I feel like I have my feet on the ground. That was incredible. And thank you, all of you who continue to show up. Talk about making a left turn. Every single one of you that's here in this work, watching the recording, or here right now in this moment with us gives such immense hope to me. I know to everybody else that sees how many people are in league and willing to zig to the left. I know that change is afoot and you're all already a part of it. And it's incredible. So thank you from our hearts.